Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night, paralyzed by fear, because you felt someone watching you? Did you know that many people can't shake that feeling because the one lurking in the shadows won't let them wake up again? And what if every whisper in the dark isn't just a sound, but a warning? Today, you'll hear stories that will make your blood run cold. Each one will make you wonder, what if these horrors are real? And what if the next victim is you? Brace yourself as we delve into the deepest fears from which there is no escape.
In the dense, sinister forest, where sunlight barely pierced through the thick cover of evergreen trees, lay an abandoned village, shrouded in mystery and fear. This forgotten place, overgrown with dark, twisted trees, was home to a horrifying legend, the witch with crooked legs. A malevolent old crone, she lured unsuspecting people into her crumbling lair to cast terrible curses on them, turning their lives into endless nightmares. The story of the witch was passed down in whispers, carried by the wind through the twisted branches of the forest. Many knew of the legend, but few dared to speak of it aloud. It was said that anyone who uttered her name would invoke her wrath, drawing death into their lives. But ignorance is bliss, and a group of young tourists who stumbled upon this cursed place knew nothing of its dark history. The sun had just dipped below the horizon when they arrived. John, Emily, Mark, and Sarah. 4 friends setting out for new experiences and adventures. They dismissed the locals' warnings with a smirk, considering them mere superstitions. They had no idea what awaited them. As night fell, the air grew colder and more sinister. The forest seemed to draw closer, with the trees becoming like prison bars. The wind howled through the branches, carrying with it an eerie, disembodied voice that seemed to call their names. But they pressed on, setting up camp near the ruins of an old moss-covered house on the edge of the village. The house stood in silence and decay, its wooden boards rotting, windows shattered, and the door barely hanging on its hinges. It seemed on the verge of collapse, yet it exuded an aura of impending horror that sent shivers down their spines. They chose to ignore it, gathering around a campfire, illuminated by the flickering flames. As night deepened, strange things began to happen. The fire crackled and hissed, scattering sparks into the air as if it were alive. Shadows danced along the edges of the clearing, moving in ways that defied the logic of the flickering flame. The air grew thick with the smell of decay, a stench that seemed to emanate directly from the ground beneath their feet. Sarah was the first to hear it. A faint, sinister melody carried on the wind, like ghostly echoes of a lullaby. It was almost hypnotic, drawing her toward the house, her legs moving of their own accord. She approached the old door, its creak echoing in the silence as she pushed it open. Inside, the air was even colder, and the smell of decay became unbearable. The floorboards creaked under her weight as she stepped in, and darkness seemed to swallow her. She barely noticed the weak, flickering light of a candle that beckoned her further into the house, guiding her into its dark corners. Her friends, noticing her absence, quickly followed, calling her name. Their voices seemed to vanish into the void, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. It felt as though the very walls were alive, absorbing sound and light, trapping them in a suffocating silence. Emily was the next to feel the witch's presence. A cold, damp hand touched her shoulder, making her body shiver with terror. She turned around, but no one was there, only the pitch-black darkness that seemed to squeeze from all sides. Her heart raced faster, the sound of her own pulse deafening as she desperately tried to find her friends. John and Mark wandered in the darkness, their flashlights flickering and dying as they moved deeper into the house. The air was thick with dust and the unmistakable scent of death. They now felt it, the presence of something sinister, something ancient and evil lurking in the shadows, watching them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As they ventured further, it felt as though the walls were closing in around them, narrow corridors twisting and turning, defying logic. The house was alive, its wooden beams groaning and creaking as if in agony. The floor beneath their feet felt soft, almost like flesh, pulsing with a nauseating rhythm that churned their stomachs. Sarah, now significantly ahead of her friends, was drawn to a room at the end of a long, dark corridor. The door creaked open, revealing a scene of unimaginable horror. The room was filled with strange, archaic symbols etched into the walls, as if with dried blood. In the center of the room stood a crude, makeshift altar, and on it, a small, twisted figure with long, crooked legs. It was the witch, her gnarled fingers clutching an ugly, ancient book, her eyes burning with malevolent fire. Her face was twisted into a grimace, and as she began chanting incantations in an ancient, guttural language, the air in the room grew heavy, as if the very atmosphere was being sucked into the whirlpool of her dark magic. Sarah froze in place, terror gripping her mind. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat constricted as if by an invisible hand. The witch's chanting grew louder, more frenzied, and the symbols on the walls began to glow with an eerie, otherworldly light. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Sarah saw her breath becoming short, panicked puffs. Suddenly there was a crack, as if the floor beneath her feet began to crumble. Shadows thickened, as if trying to pull her into the abyss. The witch's eyes, sharp as needles, pierced through her. A faint wind began to howl, as if the walls themselves wanted to engulf her. Her friends finally caught up to her, but it was too late. The witch's spell was complete, and with a final, blood-curdling scream, Sarah was engulfed by a blinding flash of light. When the light faded, she was gone, leaving only a twisted, lifeless shell where she had stood. John and Emily, horrified by the sight, stood frozen with fear. But their terror was far from over. The witch turned her gaze upon them, her eyes glowing with unholy light. She raised her hands, and the air around them vibrated with dark energy. The walls of the room began to close in, the very fabric of reality warping and twisting as the witch's power enveloped them. In a desperate attempt to survive, John grabbed Emily and Mark, dragging them out of the room through the winding corridors. It felt as though the house was fighting against them, the walls closing in, the floor bending beneath their feet. The witch's laughter echoed through the corridors, a ghastly, otherworldly sound that sent waves of horror through their bodies. They stumbled through the darkness, the witch's presence growing stronger with every step. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the sound of their own ragged breaths filled their ears. With every step, their surroundings grew more nightmarish, gaps in the walls revealing images from their worst fears, hallucinations devoid of meaning and form. John and Emily struggled against panic, their eyes widening in terror as they saw strange shadows skittering at the edges of their vision. Every movement, every rustle seemed a mortal threat. The floor beneath them occasionally gave way, exposing dark, sinister underground pits where groans and screams of those trapped before echoed. When they finally burst outside, the cold night air hit them like a wave. But the nightmare was far from over. The witch's laughter followed them into the night, and when they looked back, they saw her twisted, crooked figure standing in the doorway, her eyes glowing with malevolent light. She raised her hand, and the air around them seemed to shiver and distort. Mark, lagging behind, suddenly felt a cold, sticky hand clasp around his ankle. He screamed, but his voice was lost in the witch's laughter. He was dragged back into the darkness, his friends' cries fading away in the distance. The forest, as if alive, stretched its roots and branches to ensnare him, pulling him into endless darkness. John and Emily left the town the next day, their bodies worn out, and their souls shattered. They were in shock, unable to find words to describe the nightmare they had endured. The locals looked at them with understanding, but were not surprised. They knew that the forest and the witch would always find new victims. John and Emily left the town the next day, leaving behind everything that reminded them of that horror. But the nightmares did not leave them. The forest and the witch haunted their dreams, and every time they closed their eyes, they heard the whispers of ancient incantations and felt the cold breath of an ominous presence, reminding them that what happened in that abandoned village was not over. And so, each evening when the moon rises over the gloomy forest and the wind whispers through the twisted leaves, those who dared to approach the cursed place might hear the witch's sinister laughter and feel the cold breath of her malevolent presence, reminding them that ancient evil never dies. It only waits to claim its next victim.